the motivation, certainly for me, and I'll let Mike speak for himself, is I've had the privilege over the last 20 years to work as both a government official and as an outside academic and think tanker on the issue of U.S.-China relations. And I've seen over the last 20 years the evolution of this relationship from the early days after the end of the Cold War, when I made my first trip to China as the head of policy planning at the State Department in 1994, to see the challenges that have emerged in the relationship as China has become more economically successful and has begun to play a bigger role in the region and the world. The question of what the future of U.S.-China relations is has become more challenging. And we know from history that there are often deep challenges in managing the relationship between an established power like the United States and a rising power like China, and that too often this relationship has led to tension and even conflict. And over the last 20 years, we've gone from a situation where China was relatively weak compared to the United States to one where China is becoming more powerful. And the question about the stability and the management of that relationship has become more difficult. And we've seen, especially in the last 3 or 4 years, a lot of pessimism about the future of the relationship, a sense of inevitability of conflict between the United States and China, which, from my perspective, and I think Mike shares this, would be a terrible tragedy. It'd be a loss for everyone, because the problems the world faces today need China and the United States to work together as best they can to meet the common challenges, not just for the United States and China, but for Japan and for the rest of the world. And so the opportunity to find a way to help policymakers in both China and the United States think creatively about how to manage this very difficult and challenging relationship was one that I think is one of the most important issues of our time. And because of my own experience in trying to handle this as a government official, I felt it was important to take advantage of this period of reflection to try to give some deep thought to how to manage this relationship for the long term, to achieve the most cooperation where we can, and certainly to prevent this from descending into a condition of rivalry or even conflict.
Well, you know, I think Jim's insights were a key motivation for me, and it also made sense from the point of view of military analysis to look in detail at these two countries, because they are now the two major military powers on Earth. And there are other countries that have impressive armed forces, including Japan's. But nonetheless, China is now spending more than $150 billion a year in American equivalent dollars on its armed forces, and that number keeps going up. And this just means that we have to ask questions like, what is a reasonable, if there is a reasonable, balance between the two? What kinds of weapons should the two sides buy that can defend their interests but also not excessively threaten the other? What kind of arms control ideas might make sense, perhaps just between the two of them for starters, but perhaps involving allies and other regional partners as well? How do you have a competition, but a competition that's managed and limited so that it doesn't get out of control? And in this year, 2014, doesn't risk repeating the history that we saw 100 years ago in Europe, when very few people really predicted a 4-year-long war that could kill 20 million people or more, and yet it happened. Now, I don't think that's likely between the United States and China, but I think that a negative or destructive relationship is quite possible. And we're going to have to all work hard together to avoid it. And that's going to require some nuance and some detailed thinking, because Jim and I both agree, and we argue in the book, that the simple answers don't work. So you could say one simple answer is for the United States to just pull back from the region. But our interests and our allies are too important for that to be a viable proposition. Other people say, well, don't worry about it. We're going to get along with China no matter what, because we trade so much, we invest so much, that we're bound to be able to cooperate. No, I think history shows there are times where even economically interlinked countries wind up in conflict. Some people would say the United States should just double its efforts again and radically increase its military budget and outcompete China, sort of like we outcompeted the Soviet Union in the 1980s. But I don't think that works either, because China's economy is much more impressive than the Soviet economy of the 1980s, and it's not going to be so simple to outcompete them. And on top of that, we're not exactly trying to compete for who can control the Central Pacific. We're trying to remain very influential and very supportive of allies and interests all the way over here in the Western Pacific, very close to China's borders, which means that a competition is a pretty difficult thing to win definitively for either side. So all the simple answers are inadequate, and you've really got to get into a bit more detail to figure out what's the path ahead.
Well, I think it's important to recognize that there are two terms. There's reassurance and resolve, and that both are central to our argument, because what we are very focused on is that sometimes conflicts come because countries have interests, they're just in conflict, and there's nothing that can be done about it. They're fundamental interests which are irreconcilable, and one way or the other, one will have to prevail. But very often what we see is that conflict and tension and rivalry comes about because of misperception and misunderstanding of the other's intentions. And there are two kinds of misunderstandings that take place. Sometimes conflict comes about because one country perceives the other as being hostile or threatening, even though that's not the intention. And they respond to what they perceive to be hostility and rivalry by, in turn, preparing for a conflict where none is intended. And so this misperception, this misplaced fear, leads to a rivalry and a competition where none is intended. And the idea of reassurance is to try to address this source of conflict. The idea is to find ways to demonstrate credibly to the other side that we don't have bad intentions, that we do seek to have a good relationship, and to take very specific steps to dispel the fears that the other side has. That's where reassurance comes, to reassure through concrete measures that we want to have a cooperative relationship. But resolve is the flip side of that, because the other reason that conflict happens is because countries misperceive where a red line may be, where they misunderstand that there's an interest that's so strong, to put it very bluntly, their country is prepared to fight to defend that interest, that they make a mistake, that they misjudge the importance that one country attaches to a particular interest. And that's where resolve comes in, because it's important not only to dispel misplaced fears, but also to make clear that there are some places that are very serious and that will cause a problem if the other country pushes too far. So they come together both to try to clarify intentions, to make clear where the intentions are good, but also to make clear where there's a fighting issue. And by addressing both of those sides, we avoid the chance that conflict will come about because of misperception. Doesn't mean there won't be any conflict, because it may be that there are some areas where the two sides are just on irreconcilable positions. But it's a major step forward if we can prevent conflict from coming about because of misunderstandings of the other's intentions. That's where those two terms come from.
Well, I think that's right, and I think that what we're going to see in the years ahead is a need to develop this concept further. I like to hope that we have put out what will be the first book on this topic, and that other scholars and government officials, not only in the United States and China, but also in countries like Japan, will need to keep developing the idea, because as Jim points out, it's always going to be a complicated and complex balancing act where you try to defend your core interests, but look to show to the other side that you're not trying to be aggressive, take advantage of them, take it too far. That's a very fine line to walk in many cases. The good news is, if we develop momentum and mutual belief in this kind of an idea, and it requires, really, in the end, to be fully successful, it requires that China and the United States and American allies endorse this idea. But if we establish the momentum, then there may be a little bit of good faith that can help us get through some of the tough times. But it's going to be a very difficult proposition to walk this fine line, to reassure while also maintaining resolve and commitment to our core interests. And again, this is a strategy that we're advocating towards both Beijing and Washington and other regional capitals. We think it has to be adopted, or some variant of it needs to be adopted by all the major powers to truly maximize its potential.
These basic ideas have their roots in a lot of work that have been done by some very prominent international relations theorists over the years. Tom Schelling from Harvard, who pioneered some of the thinking in this area, Bob Jarvis, who really got us to focus on the problems of misperception in international relations. But what's I think very specifically important about this book is that we try in very concrete terms to identify how to apply these general concepts to the specific challenges in U.S.-China relations and make some suggestions about how to apply these concepts in very concrete ways to areas like nuclear weapons, to space, to cyber, to maritime operations, to military budgets, so that these are really very practical tools that policymakers can look to try to implement rather than just very general ideas. Part of the strategy that we've recommended does include this element of resolve. And then I think it's very important that the credibility and the reliability of the U.S.-Japan relationship plays a critical role in demonstrating that resolve. That is to say that it's important for the United States and Japan to communicate clearly to China that this relationship is one of a deep commitment on each side, and that China should not misjudge the seriousness with which each side treats that commitment. So I think in that context, the decisions we expect to hear from the Japanese government really do help build on the concept we talk about in the book, which is to make clear that the United States is committed to its security partnership with Japan, but Japan is equally committed to its security partnership with the United States, and that each side is prepared to do the kinds of things to give credibility to that commitment, so that China understands that there are some red lines for both of us, and that the United States and Japan are committed to each other to protect those interests. So I think that, in that sense, I think the steps that we expect the government here to take are really very much in line with the thinking that we advocate. At the same time, the reassurance concept is also very important, because there's no question that in the minds of at least some in China, that there are concerns about what the intentions are behind the Japanese government's decision to move towards a new approach to collective self-defense. And so I think it's important, in building on our concept, that at the same time that the Japanese government takes what I think are very welcome steps, that it also seeks to reassure China that these steps are not designed to threaten or contain China, but rather to build a context for a more stable relationship for all of the countries of the region.
This raises a couple of natural questions about specific issues, which I don't want to address in great detail. But one thing I'll try to point out, and I mentioned on my recent trip to China, is that Japanese military increases in spending and capability are actually very modest. And I think that's very welcome and appropriate. I think it's good that Japan send a message of a little bit greater effort without trying to go so far as to worry people in the region that it's somehow changed its basic approach towards national security. So on that point, I've been trying to argue and explain that the modest Japanese military spending increases are consistent with our argument. Our argument does not say, however, what should be the next step in the Senkaku Diaoyu dispute. It doesn't encourage either side, either Japan or China, to try to force this issue. It doesn't try to obligate the United States to take any specific response, recognizing that we are committed to Japan's security, but that, of course, a dispute over these islands growing up into something bigger would not really fit with my image of what strategic reassurance and resolve should be about. So there's an element of caution and a request for restraint in some of the logic that flows from this as well. Overall, I think that this can be managed, but it's going to take a continuous, ongoing effort by all the parties. Well, there's no doubt that I benefited greatly from my associations with scholars at Sasakawa and others in the Tokyo network. Deputy Secretary Steinberg has obviously had a tremendous experience in this region and probably didn't need as much help with his connections as I did. I've been fortunate to have a number of associations with Japanese scholars over the years, and my good friend Mike Mochizuki back in Washington is one of my best collaborators and mentors on this subject. there's absolutely no doubt that Sasakawa's support has helped me rebalance, in a sense. I was one of those American defense scholars who spent a lot of time thinking about Iraq and Afghanistan for the last 10 years. And while that was appropriate, and while certainly Jim had to do a fair amount of that himself, we also recognized the importance of the rebalance. And I'm sitting next to one of the architects of that policy. And I think Sasakawa, in the last few years, has helped me re-engage in a region that you need to stay constantly engaged in if you're going to be relevant.
I also am very appreciative of the support that Sasakawa has given to this project and more generally to its commitment to U.S.-Japan relations. I think because I have been involved in the issues around this region for a long time, I think many people questioned 20 years ago with the end of the Cold War about what the future of U.S.-Japan relations would be. Was this a relationship that was primarily rooted in the Cold War competition and might change dramatically, or that there might be tensions in the U.S.-Japan relationship because that strategic perspective had changed? And I think it has taken good work both in the United States and Japan to reimagine what this relationship is about in a more positive sense, rather than what we're against, what we are for together. And I think that Sasakawa has played a very critical role in helping us think through that question. And now, thinking forward not just for our generation, which experienced the earlier phase of U.S.-Japan relations, but especially for younger Americans and Japanese who didn't even experience the Cold War. Why is it that this relationship is so important? Why can we continue to talk about the U.S.-Japan relationship as a cornerstone of peace and stability in the region? And I think the commitment that Sasakawa has given to helping scholars and the public in both countries to think about this 21st century version of our partnership is really critical and will be of enormous long-term benefit to both of our countries and to the region as a whole.